All of a sudden, we fundamentally transformed the way the federal government operated. All of a sudden, we as Americans started becoming complacent with the idea that the federal government had the tonic that could somehow cure all of Adam's ailments, at least as they existed on the North American continent. No sooner had FDR taken power after the election of 1932, and no sooner had that power given substantial power to one party in that same election in Congress, then the federal government tried to expand. The Supreme Court initially pushed back and said, no, remember, you've got this limited set of powers. They invalidated a series of efforts to regulate at the federal level purely local activities like labor, manufacturing, agriculture, and mining. FDR, who was raised in a patrician family, I'm convinced that he played on one of those little league baseball teams where they don't keep score because everyone's a winner. By the way, I have twin boys. When they were in kindergarten, they were on such a baseball team. I kept score, even though the league formally prohibited it, and I would inform them when they lost, because what I explained to them is one of the reasons for sports is you have to learn how to lose like a gentleman. I know that from a lot of experience. If there's one thing I've learned really well, it's how to lose at sports. FDR couldn't handle this idea that there was anything he couldn't accomplish as President of the United States. And so he threatened to pack the Supreme Court. He threatened to mandate the early retirement of some of those justices who he saw as obstructing his plan for the inexorable expansion of his government. And although that plan ostensibly failed in Congress, it had its intended effect, its intended in terrorem effect. And the Supreme Court in 1937 laid the seeds for what became effectively one of the single most important, one of the single most influential adjustments to our constitutional system of government in all of history. But this one didn't involve a constitutional amendment. It involved what started with one single Supreme Court decision. The case was NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Company. In that case in 1937, the Supreme Court, undoing what it had said in previous cases just a few years earlier, said that the Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution, gave Congress the power to regulate any and every activity that, when measured in the aggregate, when replicated across many states, substantially affects interstate commerce. Now, for those of you who don't recognize this immediately for what it is, it's just legalese for a pretty simple concept, which is that Congress may, without interference from the courts, and may, as long as Congress doesn't get careful in its drafting, regulate basically any aspect of human existence. Because everything we do in some way or another has a significant impact, has some effect on interstate commerce. So if this is the definition, then Congress may regulate just about anything. Arguably, this could even extend as far as Congress telling you where to go to the doctor and how to pay for it, telling you you have to buy health insurance, not just any kind of health insurance, but that type of health insurance that Congress, in its infinite wisdom, deems appropriate and necessary for every American to buy. Now, this part is subject to debate. I personally think that even under the loose standards established during the New Deal era, the Affordable Care Act takes this a few steps too far, and I think it's encouragingly likely that the Supreme Court will do the right thing and invalidate the individual mandate within the Obamacare statute. But setting that aside, let's remember that over the last 75 years, there have been only two instances. Once in 1995 in a case called United States versus Lopez, and another in 2000 in a case called United States versus Morrison, in which the Supreme Court has held that Congress overstepped its authority under the Commerce Clause. In both instances, in both cases, the Supreme Court said, in effect, well, Congress got sloppy in its drafting. In the 95 case, Lopez, it said that Congress had gone too far in drafting the Gun-Free School Zones Act. And in the 2000 case, Morrison, the Supreme Court said it went a little too far and got sloppy in how it drafted the Violence Against Women Act. But it didn't repudiate, it didn't even really step back from or ratchet down the underlying case law that had made this possible. Now, my purpose here is not to talk about the Supreme Court. It's not to blame the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had reasons for doing what it did, and in many respects, what it did reflected just the mindset that says members of Congress ought to debate the constitutional merits of their own power before they exercise it. Now, this was true for most of the history of our republic, up to the 1930s. It often happened, and I suspect the members of the Supreme Court who felt comfortable with that line of decisions initially rested assured by the fact that Congress could still have this debate, this constitutional debate consisting of, what should we be doing under this Constitution? Since we are a government of limited powers, should we, must we, ought we be able to regulate every aspect of human existence? I suspect many, if not most of those justices thought that in many, if not most instances, the answer would be no. But that isn't what happened. Members of Congress have instead seen the promise of judicial non-interference, non-intervention as a perpetually green light, saying you have to do, you are free to do in a manner that's consistent with your oath to the Constitution, which you have to take under Article 6 of the Constitution when you become a member of Congress, that you may do whatever you want, anything you want that you think is beneficial for the country. But instead of having that debate, members of Congress have forged ahead. That's how we've gotten to where we are today. So between 1910 and 1920, we multiplied our national debt by a factor of 10, going from $2.6 billion to $26 billion, just in one decade. I wish it had stopped there. Now we're at a position in history where our national debt is fast approaching, and by the end of this year will reach $15 trillion. Now, when you divide that up among 300 million Americans, it's about $50,000 a head. When you divide it up among taxpayers, it's more like $150,000 a head. Could be higher, depending on whose statistics you use. We have this, and we have this erosion of our individual liberties as a result of the fact that Congress knows no bounds on its substantive limits. Everything is on the table. So whether it's subsidizing Solyndra or some other company, or whether it's trying to undermine our individual liberties in other areas, whether it's our Fourth Amendment rights or our Fifth Amendment rights to property, or whatever the case may be, it all happens. It's all made possible as a result of this mindset that is fundamentally incompatible with and threatening to the concept of individual liberty that we as Americans hold so sacred, that is enshrined in the Constitution. How then do we pull it back? Well, I don't believe we can wait for the court to get it right. They've had about 75 years and they haven't gone back on what they allowed. I think we have to look back at the fact that it was the political branches of government, branches of government operating under Articles 1 and 2 of the Constitution, Congress and the presidency. Those are the branches that we have to focus on in order to restore this concept of constitutionally limited government. Now, as much as we in this room get excited about the idea of the enumerated powers of Congress, as much as we in this room believe in the 10th Amendment and believe and understand instinctively that all of our other freedoms, our individual liberty, happens to be bound up with the 10th Amendment and the concept of enumerated federal powers, many of our fellow Americans may not get as excited as we do about it. So how then do we influence the political process so as to restore what we know needs to be restored? This is where we change the game. By linking together, in much the same way that those who are on the opposite end of the political spectrum have done, those who advocate big government, those who see at the end of the day, freedom as equivalent to socialism, we use a similar strategy in that we link these things together. Now, they've linked it together in a way that's deceptive and ultimately threatening to liberty. We'll link these two together in a way that makes clear to our fellow Americans that this will lead to liberty. That is, we will link it together with economic policy. Let me explain what I mean. Just as we couldn't have had the expansion of the federal government occurring in the way that it has occurred without the Supreme Court condoning it in some way, and the Supreme Court saying, we're not going to interfere with this, we also could not have had this unfettered expansion of the federal government without an enormous acquisition of debt. So in any representative government, anytime government wants to expand, that's going to cost money. So there is a cycle that occurs. Government wants to expand, so it taxes. It collects those taxes. And then in the process of spending that tax revenue, the government becomes more powerful. It is sadly the nature and disposition of mankind that when people become more powerful, they lust after even more power. But to exercise the more power that they crave, they demand additional money, so they need to tax more. The cycle can perpetuate itself, but for the fact that when they have to go back to the people who fund government and say we need more taxes, they place themselves at a significant risk that they will lose their jobs because they'll be voted out of office if they're too aggressive, if they're too greedy in what they demand of taxes. But this is why deficit spending is such a boon to those who want to expand government. It's such a boon to those who want to pursue freedom somehow through socialism, genuinely believing, as I believe they do, that this will promote freedom, notwithstanding the fact that those of us who study history, those of us who are willing to learn from its painful lessons, understand that pursuing anything through government expansion, pursuing anything through the idea that government is all-powerful, that we all serve at the pleasure of the government, that we all live at the mercy of the government, ultimately ends in captivity, in tyranny, and not in freedom. That's why deficit spending facilitates government expansion, and that's why deficit spending is such a problem. It interrupts this cycle. It makes it possible for politicians to have the ultimate dual kick. I will increase the government benefits that you want, and you won't have to pay for it. They can arrogate to themselves more power without having to tax for it, at least not immediately. They postpone the day of reckoning. They put off the obligation until some future date, when circumstances will no doubt be much greater. It'll no doubt be much easier for our children and their children after them to pay off our debts than it is for us today. Therefore, we will let them pay for it, even though they're not old enough to vote yet, even though some of them have yet to be born, even though in some cases their parents have yet to meet. We will let them pay for it. It feels an awful lot like taxation without representation. And we have to remember that taxation without representation has been a problem for us before. In fact, we fought a war over taxation without representation, and the last time I checked, we won that war. We must reclaim the benefits of that war.